15 American warships. One of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. A U.S. blockade. And somehow, one Chinese-linked tanker just sailed straight through. Washington has already sanctioned this ship for a long time for transporting oil from Iran to China. It was exactly the kind of vessel America was supposed to stop. But instead of being turned back like other ones, this one crossed the Strait of Hormuz, as if the blockade did not exist. At first, it looked like a stunning challenge to U.S. power. Then, just one day later, the ship suddenly turned back. So what really happened? Was this China testing America? Did Washington deliberately let it pass? Or are we watching the start of a much bigger battle between the world's two superpowers in the Middle East? Because this is no longer just about one tanker. It is about oil, global trade, military deterrence, and the question of whether America still controls the world's most important energy choke point. What happened next may completely change how the world sees power in the Middle East, where history moves faster than maps can update. 1 week, it is diplomacy. The next week it is destroyers, tankers, sanctions, and presidents making threats loud enough for the whole world to hear. And right now, one of the most dramatic chapters in the China-United States rivalry is unfolding in a way that almost feels too cinematic to be real. Imagine this. 15 American warships spread across the Strait of Hormuz like bouncers outside the world's most expensive nightclub. President Trump makes it clear. America controls the sea. America decides who moves. America still runs the show. And then something happens that nobody expected. A Chinese-linked tanker calmly sails straight through. Not sneaking. Not hiding. Not turning off its signals like some spy thriller. Just moving. Like it has an appointment. And honestly, that might be the funniest and most ironic part of this entire story. Because for years, the image of American power in the Middle East has been built around one idea. If Washington wants a ship stopped, the ship stops. Except this time, it didn't. The ship at the center of this drama is the tanker Rich Starry, also known in some Chinese reporting as Fuxing Hao. That is not just any cargo vessel. That is a ship that the United States has already sanctioned due to links to Iranian trade networks. On paper, this should be exactly the kind of ship America is watching most closely. And yet it crossed the Strait of Hormuz carrying around 250,000 barrels of methanol loaded from Hamriya, in the United Arab Emirates, and headed toward China. That is where this story stops being about shipping and starts becoming a geopolitical thriller. Because this was never just about one tanker. It was a test. A test of American military pressure. A test of sanctions. A test of narrative control. And maybe most importantly, a test of whether China is now willing to challenge the United States in the Middle East without firing a single shot. The optics are almost absurd. Imagine a police officer shouting that no one gets through a roadblock. Then one blacklisted truck drives straight through while 6 others get turned back. People are going to ask questions. A lot of questions. And those questions go straight to the heart of U.S. power. But then comes the twist. Just as headlines start celebrating this as a direct challenge to America, the Rich Starry suddenly turns back the next day, and is later reported anchored off Iran. That changes everything. Because this is no longer a simple victory lap. Now it becomes something much more interesting. A chess match. A probe. A signal. A floating question mark. So why does this matter so much? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway. It is the world's energy throat. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil trade moves through this narrow passage. That makes it the single most important oil choke point on Earth. When tensions rise here, prices rise everywhere. Toronto feels it. Texas feels it. Shanghai feels it. Berlin absolutely complains about it. If oil is the blood of the global economy, Hormuz is one of its main arteries. And right now, both America and China are staring directly at that artery for completely different reasons. For the United States, the Middle East has long been the stage where it projects power. Aircraft carriers, naval escorts, coalitions, missile defense systems. For decades, the message has been simple. We keep the sea lanes open. That role has been central to American influence since the Cold War. But China's rise has changed the equation. China is now one of the world's largest energy importers. A massive portion of its oil and petrochemical supply depends on stable Middle Eastern routes. So while America sees Hormuz as a security zone, China increasingly sees it as an economic lifeline. And this is where the irony gets really interesting. For years, Washington criticized Beijing for freeriding on U.S. naval security in the Gulf. The joke was simple. China buys the oil. America guards the road. But now China seems increasingly willing to say something very different. Thanks for the road. We'll decide how we drive. That is the real contest. That is not tanks versus tanks. That is influence versus influence. One side brings warships. The other brings trade routes, shipping networks, and carefully calculated diplomacy. In geopolitical terms, America brings the hammer. China brings the calculator. And in the modern world, sometimes the calculator wins quietly. What makes this even more fascinating is the legal gray zone. The United States says the blockade targets vessels calling at Iranian ports. But the Rich Starry loaded in the UAE, not Iran. That technical distinction gave Washington a legal reason not to stop it. Legally neat. Politically messy. Because here is the irony. The United States already sanctions the same ship for its links to Iran. So it is dangerous enough to block. But apparently not dangerous enough to physically stop. That kind of selective enforcement practically writes its own satire. It makes sanctions look less like an iron law and more like an elastic policy. Stretch when needed. Relax when convenient. And that is exactly the kind of contradiction China can exploit. Not by confrontation. By exposure. By simply allowing the world to watch the contradiction unfold in real time. That is where the contest becomes psychological. The United States wants to maintain deterrence. China wants to prove deterrence has limits. Neither side necessarily wants war. But both sides absolutely want narrative advantage. And in modern superpower competition, narrative may be just as important as hardware. Who looks stronger? Who looks calmer? Who looks like the side preserving global trade? China's messaging has leaned hard into this. Beijing frames any targeted blockade as dangerous and harmful to navigation security. That language is extremely strategic. It positions China as the defender of commerce and international rules. And that is incredibly clever. America's historical image in the Gulf has long been protector of shipping. China is now trying to borrow that image. Honestly, that is a bold move. It is like showing up to someone else's birthday party and somehow walking away with the cake. Now let's be clear. The United States still has overwhelming naval power in the region. It is not a story about China replacing America militarily overnight. It is about something much more subtle. Relative leverage. China's economic ties to Gulf states, particularly with Iran, and global energy markets are now large enough that American moves must increasingly factor in Beijing's reaction. That alone is a massive shift from the early 2000s. Back then, Washington largely moved on its own timetable. Today, every move must be measured against China. That means the Middle East is no longer just a regional theater. It is now a front line in the US-China global rivalry. Trade war meets tanker war. With slightly more expensive fuel. And this part matters to everyone watching. Because this is not just about ships and military strategy. It affects everyday life. When the strait becomes unstable, inflation risks rise. Shipping insurance costs jump. Freight rates increase. Manufacturing costs rise. And yes, eventually everyone pays more at the pump. Usually everyone. That is why this is not just a military story. That is about factories in China, gas stations in Canada, plastic products in Europe, food prices almost everywhere. Now, methanol itself may sound boring. But let's be honest. No one hears methanol shipment and thinks blockbuster movie. Nobody says pass the popcorn. But it is crucial for industrial supply chains. Chemicals, manufacturing, plastics, energy applications. This cargo exceeds one shipload. It represents continuity. China's industrial machine depends on thousands of flows just like this. The real contest is whether America can stop them from flowing to China. And whether China can prove that the US cannot. History makes this even more interesting. It is not the first time Hormuz has become a global flashpoint. During the tanker war in the 1980s, shipping in the Gulf was repeatedly targeted during the Iran-Iraq conflict. Even then, great powers had to balance military pressure with commercial neutrality. History echoes. Different flags. Different presidents. Same narrow waterway. The sea remembers. What changes is who believes they own the moment. In 2026, the United States wants to project dominance. China wants to project inevitability. That contrast is fascinating. America says we can stop the flow. China says the flow will continue. Those are not just military positions. They are competing visions of world order. One is based on strategic enforcement. The other is based on economic interdependence. And then there is the internet. Predictably, social media turned this entire event into meme fuel. People joked that 15 warships could not stop one tanker. Others pointed out that the ship later turned back, making the early celebration look premature. Classic internet behavior. Declare victory at 9 a.m. Reverse the take by lunch. Pretend you knew all along by dinner. But beneath the memes is something much more serious. This event exposed uncertainty. And uncertainty is the enemy of deterrence. If allies, markets, and rivals are no longer sure what the United States will enforce, when it will enforce it, and against whom, then the psychological edge begins to weaken. China understands this perfectly. Beijing often plays the long game. Not dramatic confrontations. Slow shifts. A tanker is crossing today. A diplomatic statement tomorrow. An energy deal next month. Piece by piece, influence accumulates. That is less Hollywood and more chess. Although chess with destroyers is still pretty Hollywood. So what does this really mean? First, China is no longer just an economic actor in the Middle East. It is becoming a geopolitical one. Not in the old American style of bases and bombing campaigns, but through infrastructure, trade, mediation, and strategic signaling. And perhaps, more importantly, thousands of Chinese missiles are ready to be fired from the air, caves, roads, seas, and under the water. Beijing implies it, and Washington sees it. And it leads to the second implication: the US can no longer assume automatic compliance from the global shipping system. Sanctions still matter. A lot. But they are not magic. As alternative payment systems, insurance channels, and trade routes grow, unilateral control becomes harder. And thirdly, the Middle East itself is changing. Regional players are balancing. They do business with China. They used to rely on US security ties, but the Iran war lets them see another side of the case. So they begin to hedge. That makes the region less black and white than before. Not pro-America versus anti-America. More like this. Who brings stability, investment, and flexibility to the region? Sometimes the answer is both. Sometimes neither. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this rivalry so dangerous. Because the real contest is not about one tanker. It is about credibility. Can America still enforce red lines? Can China operate across them? Can either side do this without pushing the region toward a larger crisis? That is the question hanging over every ship entering Hormuz right now. And it is a question the whole world is quietly paying for. At the end of the day, one image remains. A narrow stretch of water. Warships on patrol. Markets on edge. And one sanctioned tanker gliding through like it forgot to read the memo. That image captures the strange irony of our age. Power is still visible. But control is no longer absolute. The United States still has the strongest military presence. China increasingly has the strongest economic stake. And the Middle East has become the place where those realities collide. Not always with explosions. Sometimes with spreadsheets. Sometimes with shipping logs. Sometimes with a ship that just keeps moving. And maybe that is the most modern kind of power contest. Not who fires first, but who keeps trade flowing while making the other side look helpless. Because in the 21st century, sometimes the sharpest weapon is not a missile, but a sanctioned tanker moves freely, ignoring 15 warships.